Introducing our first author is Mr. George Zamora, member of the Gaithersburg Community Advisory Committee and the Board of Supervisors of Elections. George is also a former congressional staffer for Congresswoman Donna Edwards. George?
Hey folks, good morning. Again, welcome to Gaithersburg Book Festival. It's a great event, and all right, let me talk to the mic. Can you hear me now better? No? Okay. Today, as a former congressional staffer, it is to me a great honor to introduce Mr. Daniel Hernandez. You may recognize his name as the Congressional intern who saved the life of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords on January 8, 2011, after she had been shot at the Tucson mall. Daniel is an example of human virtue. Stories like Daniel's remind us that even during the most challenging moments, when despair becomes overwhelming, humanity prevails. During that morning, his background, his political affiliation, his religious beliefs didn't matter. His sense of humanity drove him to do what he was supposed to do, to help another human being who needed him. We're living in a time of great economic, technological, and social changes. Unfortunately, these changes have also brought a new wave of violence and hatred towards society. However, even when these vices seem to become too great to bear, people like Daniel remind us that virtue will and can prevail. Tough times still lay ahead, and it is up to us as a community and role models like Daniel to come together and take action. We all want to help one another. That's what humans do. Although Daniel has repeatedly asked not to be called a hero, his actions made him one. Daniel is an example of a true American hero, a man who in the face of danger and tragedy did not flinch but took immediate action. Our actions are what define us. And Daniel, buddy, your actions define you as a hero. Thank you.
I'm a little taller than George, so I'm going to adjust the mic. Can you hear me? Perfect. Well, I'm really excited to be back on the East Coast here in Maryland. It's been a while since I've been here. A little bit better. I just got in from the airport a little while ago. I got delayed last night in Minneapolis, so I'm going to apologize if my voice sounds a little hoarse. But what I'd like to do is first read chapters 1 and 2 of the book, and then afterwards talk a little bit about what happened afterwards, and then I'll go ahead and open it up to questions for the last 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, or if you don't have questions, now you have a warning and you can start thinking of them now, because we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A session. And I'd love to, this is my favorite part of being able to go around the country, having that back and forth and being able to talk to folks one-on-one and having this interchange instead of me just talking at you for an hour. So the book is called They Call Me a Hero. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, one of my dear friends, Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman-Schultz from Florida, wrote the foreword, talking about the importance of public service. I was very fortunate to be able to team up with Simon & Schuster after 2012 started. And in my spare time, while working on a campaign and being on a school board, finding the time to work with a wonderful writer of many young adult books that are very highly regarded, named Susan Goldman Rubin. We were able to sit down together and work really hard to try and turn out a product that's not just about what happened on January the 8th in Tucson, but also talking about the importance of public service and the importance of getting involved, which is one of the main messages from the book. So the book was split up into a few different sections. The first section is on the shooting in Tucson, and it's called Chapter 1, Saturday Morning. Gun, someone said, and it clicked. I remembered some of the things that had happened over the past several months. There had been a campaign event where an angry constituent had brought a gun but dropped it, and the door of Gabby's congressional office had been shot out after the healthcare vote. Gabe Zimmerman, Gabby's aide, had come up to me that morning and said, "If you see anything suspicious, let me know." So I heard the shots, and the first thing I thought of was Gabby and making sure that she was okay. I was about 30 to 40 feet away from where the Congresswoman was when I heard the shots starting to ring out. I don't consider myself a hero, and I did what I thought anyone should have done, because in my belief, heroes are people who are not doing things just as a one-off, but instead are people who are committed to helping people for a lifetime. I was just a 20-year-old intern who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. That Saturday, January 8th of 2011, was starting like any ordinary day. I had gotten dressed in business casual clothes, shirt, an Argyle sweater, and khakis, what I would normally wear to the office. Gabe Zimmerman had organized a Congress on Your Corner event in the Casas Adobe Shopping Center just north of Tucson. Representative Giffords liked to meet with her constituents one-on-one to be able to talk to them about what was going on in Washington, D.C., but to be able to hear from them what were their big concerns so that she could take that back to Washington, D.C., and be able to fight for them and represent their interests. After a very contentious election in 2010 and a very narrow victory, I applied for an internship in her office after having known her for years and having worked on her campaign. And I was supposed to actually start on January 12th, which was the first day of school for the University of Arizona. But one of the things that oftentimes happens in a congressional office that's near a university is a lot of the interns that are there aren't there all the time because a lot of them are coming in from out of town. So when it's times for Christmas break or summer break, they are oftentimes going back home. So because I lived in Tucson and I was a native Tucsonan, I was asked if I would be willing to stop by and start working early on January 3rd instead of January 12th, which was the day that the University of Arizona was officially starting. I had known Gabby's for years. I had worked on her campaign since I had met her in June of 2008. And she is one of the kindest and warmest individuals you'll ever meet. One of the things that she would often say is, "I don't do handshakes, honey, I do hugs." Gabe had asked me to be at the Safeway market at the corner of Ina and Oracle by 9 a.m. to help with setup. By mistake, I had actually gone to the wrong Safeway that morning, and I didn't get to the right one until about 9:30. And one of the things that people that know me well know is I was born late. I'm going to be late to everything all the time. Even today, I showed up a couple hours late because I got delayed. But I always have this awful habit, and I'm always trying to break it, of trying to show up on time, if not early, to things. By the time I actually got there, most of the setup was actually done. Everyone else on staff was already there. And the things that were left were putting up a sandwich board outside of the market so that people knew what the event was and where it would be. I then, after putting up the sandwich board, helped Gabe hang up a banner that said, United States Congress, Gabrielle Giffords. And we had both the U.S. flag and the Arizona state flag. My job that day was to sign people in. I was going to be the gatekeeper, so everyone that came in had to come through me. And the reason we did that is to maintain an order, but also because everyone that came in, we wanted to be able to send them a thank you note for spending a part of their Saturday morning with us. The Congresswoman knew how important and how difficult it could be for people to wait in line for an hour or two to be able to talk to her. So she really appreciated the fact that people were willing to come in and sit and wait while she was talking to other constituents. The other thing that she would do is if there was someone having a problem with a federal agency and we had their contact information, it'd be so much easier to help them if we already knew how to get a hold of them after they talked with her. So Gabe was a social worker prior to joining the staff of the Congresswoman's office. And being the consummate social worker, he was someone that we lovingly referred to as a constituent whisperer. No matter how angry someone would call into the office, Gabe was always the person that was able to calmly listen to them and find out what the real issue was and try and have them not just calm down for the sake of calming them down, but to try and see what we could do and what the Congresswoman's office could do to help them. It was cold that morning, but it was clear. One of the other staffers, Pam Simon, the community outreach director, went into the market for coffee, but before she went in, she asked Gabe if there was anything that he would like, but he said no, and he actually did something that is really kind, and it's really an example of what kind of person he was. When she asked him if he'd like anything from inside the store, he said no, but have you asked Daniel? Pam hadn't met me yet, I was only in the office for 5 days prior to this event, and she'd been gone for 3 of them. So she didn't know who I was. And what oftentimes would happen is when new people come to the office, until you see them for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, there's so many people coming in and out that it's hard for them to know who everyone is. And interns are a lot of times forgotten in this kind of situation because we're really at the bottom of the totem pole, and they're running around just doing their jobs. When constituents started arriving, they had to go through me. I was standing with a clipboard to register them at the back of the wall, closer to the entrance of a Walgreens, because it was in a shopping center. Gabby was about 40 feet away from where I was, standing near the entrance of the Safeway Market. As people lined up waiting to speak to her, they wrote down their name, address, and their phone numbers. We were keeping track of everyone, as I mentioned a couple while ago. And then here's one of the things that I still remember quite vividly, and this was a young girl named Christina Taylor Green. She was 9 years old. She was coming with her neighbor named Susie Heilman. Christina was a student at Mesa Verde Elementary School. She had just been elected to the student council. And because I was used to being the youngest person in a room when I was doing things in politics, I thought it was so important that everyone be treated with the same kind of respect, whether they were 9 years old or 90. And when she came in with Susie, I gave a clipboard to Susie, but I also got another one and gave it to Christina. And this small gesture of acknowledging someone who was only 9 years old and asking her to sign in made her seem and made her feel like she was important. And that was one of the things that I wanted to convey to everybody that came in. You know, the Congresswoman told us that she thought everyone was important. And we were trying to show everyone that we were respecting the Congresswoman's wishes, but more importantly, that we understood that everyone was important. She seemed to grow about 9 inches because she stood up so straight when someone actually paid attention to her. And then when I talked to her and I had a conversation, she said she wanted to help. She wanted my help coming up with a good question, because this was the first time she was ever going to meet a woman who was involved in politics. She was so excited, and she had wanted to come up with a question that wasn't going to be silly. And we had these press releases and pieces of information that were way over her head that we provided for folks that were coming in. And I gave one of those to her, not because I knew that she would understand what was going on, but because I wanted to make her feel important and try and help her and guide her. The information, of course, was way over her head, but she started thinking of a question, and Susie was really grateful that someone from the office was willing to listen to this 9-year-old girl and pay attention to her. Because, again, when you come to this kind of event and you are the youngest person, it's really easy to kind of get lost and to kind of get ignored. Gabe had set up stanchions, which are the metal poles with polyester bands that are used at bank to help customers form lines. Gabe was really fond of these stanchions. He had actually purchased them with his own money. He really liked order, and he really liked being able to clearly define an entrance and an exit. So for him, it was one of the joys in his life to be able to go through and help with events, but to be able to have a clear entry and exit. So he had set up these stanchions, and I was standing at the back of those, and at 9:55, Gabby pulled up in her car. At 10 o'clock, she greeted everyone and said, "Thank you so much for coming this morning and joining us on a chilly Saturday." She was wearing a bright red jacket, and Gabe stood nearby in case a constituent needed help with a federal agency. But the other person that was there was Ron Barber, who's now a member of Congress. He was her dedicated district director, and he was listening and watching proudly as his boss talked to folks with a level of knowledge and expertise on a wide range of issues that, you know, is very difficult to match. At the time where she started the event, there was actually one person who wasn't waiting in line who talked to her first, and that was a federal judge named John M. Roll. He was someone who had known Gabby for years, and even though he was a Republican, they were working together on a lot of justice issues, with the Department of Justice opening up a new courthouse in Yuma, a federal courthouse. They had worked together diligently to make sure that the people in that part of the state were being represented. At the back of the line, I was signing in someone named Bill Badger, a retired Army colonel. And although he was a Republican and Gabby was a Democrat, he admired her and actually had a complaint that day, but he was there because he knew that she would be able to answer his question. I had just checked in Bill Badger when I heard what I thought was gunfire. It was 10:10 a.m., and for about half a second, I thought maybe this is fireworks. Sounds like we have a drum circle out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit closer to the mic, and I hope that it works and you can hear me. The next chapter is called Stop the Bleeding. There was blood everywhere, bodies on the ground, and there was screaming. As I rushed toward the sidewalk in front of the market, I passed the gunman. I saw him shooting with a pistol. Sorry. That's a little distracting, but we're going to keep going. He was running through the entry line that we had set up, and I was running in through the exit. The whole time, he was continuing to fire into the line of people. We're going to give it just a second, because this is a part of the book that it's kind of difficult to talk over a drum, so I'm going to apologize. Okay, a little bit better now that you can hear me, but I'm going to start again. Chapter 2, Stop the Bleeding. There was blood everywhere, bodies were on the ground, and there was screaming. As I rushed toward the sidewalk in front of the market, I passed the gunman. I saw him shooting with a pistol outside, and I was running in through the exit, and he was running out through the entry. The whole time, he was continuing to fire into the line of people who were there to see the Congresswoman. He was indiscriminately shooting into the crowd. And I'm big, and I didn't actually think about tackling him, because at the time, in the split second that I made a decision, I decided that it would be more useful for me to not tackle him, but instead to run towards the front of the line to help those who had already been injured, because there was gunshot injuries, and I knew that there was likelihood of people bleeding out, even though I wasn't an expert by any means, because I'd only ever been trained as a certified nursing assistant and as a phlebotomist. I knew that the medical training that I had was probably more than anyone around me at the time. So I decided in that split second that I was going to go and help the people who had been injured first around the Congresswoman, because they were the ones who needed the most amount of help immediately. And by the time that I ran to the front of the line, and it was, again, keep in mind, only 40 feet away, and it was less than 9 seconds from when the shooting started to when I got to the front of the line, I saw the first person. The first victim was Gabe. I first checked his neck and then his wrist, but he was already dead. Ron Barber, who was Gabby's district director, was on the ground and he was bleeding. He was still conscious and he was in a state of shock and in a lot of pain. But even through this, and this was something that I oftentimes remind people, the caliber and the quality of people that Gabby surrounded herself with, even though he'd been shot twice, he said, "Don't worry about me, go help other people." The first shot had gone through his thigh. The second had actually grazed his cheek, and now he calls it his dimple. But he was telling me, someone who was trying to tend to his wounds, not to focus on him and to go help other people. And that was something that's so striking, that the people who were around her and who worked for her were so passionate about helping other people that even when they've been injured in such a horrific way, they're still thinking of other people. I moved a little bit further, and I saw the person who I was most concerned with, and that was Gabby. And I was most concerned because I knew that if there was a gunman, she would likely be the target because of what I had mentioned earlier, where someone had came to a debate in Sierra Vista and dropped a gun, but also someone shooting out the door of her congressional office in Tucson. So in that split second that I was running over, I knew that if there was a gunman, and there was, she would likely be the target, and anyone around her would likely be a potential victim. I saw Gabby, and at first it looked as though she had been in a defensive position. I'd hoped that she had been uninjured, but as I got closer, I saw that she had fallen and was lying on the sidewalk, bleeding from a single wound to her head. I quickly started to check her body to see if there was any other injuries, and there wasn't any other visible wounds. Seeing none, I started applying pressure to her wound because I didn't have any medical equipment. I started using my bare hand. I pulled Gabby into my lap and actually was kind of kneeling behind her because what had started to happen is she had started to asphyxiate. She had started breathing in the blood from her wound. So my first job was to try and make sure that she didn't suffocate. So I put her up against my body and using my right arm, kind of hugged her up against my chest and was holding her head, using direct pressure to try and stop the blood loss as much as possible. she was still alert and she was still conscious, and though she couldn't talk, she was responding to simple commands. She had been shot once in the head, right above her left eye, and she was trying to communicate, and she was actually trying to stand up. So I had to hold her back, but I would ask her questions, and I knew that it was so important with a brain injury to keep her engaged. So I would say, Gabby, if you understand that you've been shot, show me 2 fingers. Or if you understand that the ambulance is on its way, squeeze my hand. And she was responding to all of these things. And I would also say things like, if you understand that the ambulance is coming and that you're going to be okay, squeeze my hand. While there was a lot of blood, it didn't look like she was going to be bleeding out. It was a brain injury. It wasn't going to be an arterial bleed. She could have lost a lot of blood if she had had an arterial bleed. One of the things that I mentioned a second ago was I was trained in high school as a nursing assistant as a phlebotomist. But in this kind of training, they don't teach you trauma. It was one of those things where they taught you basic first aid. And I was waiting to see who could come in with better training because I knew that I wasn't the expert. And as we were waiting, we had a doctor and a wife who was a nurse. They were inside buying Brussels sprouts. They were named the Bowmans. Dr. David Bowman and nurse, his wife, Nurse Nancy Bowman. And after the shooting stopped and they thought that it was safe to go outside, they went outside from the inside of the Safeway Market and actually started going and checking all of the people and doing assessments in their quick succession, trying to see what they could do. And when they got to me, David said, "You're doing the exact right thing. Keep doing what you're doing." And that made me feel vindicated that I was doing what I needed to do, and that until the EMTs could come in, that I needed to keep doing exactly what I was doing, which was keeping her engaged, keeping her calm, but keeping her in a position where she couldn't move around. One of the things that started happening right away is a lot of chaos and confusion usually follows a mass shooting of any kind or any kind of traumatic instance like that. And even though we had EMTs on the scene within 5 minutes, because the police department and the sheriff's department didn't want to add to the number of victims, they didn't let them come in. So they had set up a perimeter, and they didn't know who the assailants were. They didn't know who the victims were because there's so much confusion. So for 9 minutes, while we're waiting for them to clear the scene, I'm holding the Congresswoman's head. But in that time, one of the things that happened was a woman named Pat Maish had grabbed the clip as the young man tried to reload. Roger Selsgaber, who was standing about 8 feet from where Gabby was when she was shot, and the 70-year-old man, Bill Badger, that I talked about a second ago, were the ones who actually had wrestled this 21-year-old man to the ground and were sitting on top of him until the sheriff's department was able to finally detain him. The person who I had mentioned earlier, who was the community outreach director, Pam Simon, who had gone in to buy coffee, was standing about 10 feet in front of where the Congresswoman was, and someone walked by her while I was talking and holding Gabby's injury and said, "She's a goner." The sirens were wailing, and minutes later, police arrived and paramedics started arriving. Gabby kept trying to move around, and when the paramedics were finally allowed to come in and help us, they asked me where Gabby had been injured, and I told her the one obvious injury. They started taking care of her medical needs, and they actually started just taking over all of that, but they wanted someone to stay with her and keep her engaged and keep her as calm as possible. They couldn't give her pain medication. They couldn't even start an IV because she was moving around so much and was in so much pain. So they just wanted to have someone there essentially holding her hand and letting her know that everything was going to be okay. One of the things that happened afterwards is there was so much chaos and there was so much shock. Even the people that did this on a regular basis for their living, the people that were EMTs and paramedics and sheriff's deputies, didn't need someone to tell them what had happened because they could see everything that had happened. What they needed was someone to tell them what to do, because there were not just people who were first responders. They were people that were constituents or friends of the people that had been injured. Tucson is a small community, and this was a very beloved member of Congress, and it was their member of Congress, and she had been shot in the head. So the paramedics are wanting to help, and they're helping her by putting her on a stretcher. But the decision was in the beginning, do we take her in an ambulance or do we take her in a helicopter? and they wanted to take her in a helicopter because it would be faster. But I asked them, how long is it going to be? A simple question, but one that nobody had thought of. And they said they had no idea. And it was then, when they said that they had no idea how long it would be before it could come, that I made the decision for them, and I told them, we need to go now. And we were able to get her into an ambulance. And within 30 minutes, we were able to get to a Class 1 trauma center. So between 10:10 and 10:40, she was at the Safeway, but by 10:40, she was inside of an operating room with some of the best doctors in all of Arizona, and I would say all of the country, and they started trying to save her life there. While we were headed to the hospital and we were in the ambulance, I made 2 phone calls. One of the things that I wanted to do was actually make sure that we contacted her family, because I didn't want them to find out from the press that she had been injured, because the initial reports were actually that she had died. And I'll come back to this in just a second and explain why those reports happened that way. But I wanted to have someone call her husband, Mark, who was living in Houston. He was working at NASA at the time as an astronaut, and her parents, Gloria and Spencer, who lived right outside of Tucson. I didn't have the phone numbers. I actually didn't have any phone numbers. I'd gotten a new cell phone for Christmas a few days prior, and I hadn't had the time to update the phone numbers. So the only numbers that I had were my parents, and then one of the people who was involved in politics in Tucson, who was the person whose campaign I had run in 2010, a local state representative named Steve Farley. So I called Steve because I knew he would be able to quickly get a hold of the other people that we needed to notify. And by the time that we got to the hospital, Gloria, who was Gabby's mother, was already about 5 minutes away from the hospital, because she was able to get the information from us and not from others that her daughter had been injured. So while we were waiting outside of the Safeway, the people from inside actually came out and said, what can we do? How can we help? And this is, again, another example of, even in such a traumatic and such a kind of dangerous time, people stepping up and saying, I want to help, and everyone kind of coming together. And the folks from inside the Safeway asked us, what can we give you? What do you need? And I said I wanted gauze or some linen, something clean that we could use to help with the wounds. They didn't have anything like that inside of a Safeway market because it's a grocery store. What they came back with was meat smocks from the meat department that were clean. So they had these smocks that people who, are butchers would wear, and they brought them out. And when they brought those out, the first thing that I did was direct someone to actually cover Gabe Zimmerman, who, again, was the community outreach director, a young guy. He was only 30 when he was killed, because I didn't want someone walking by with a camera or a camera phone and taking pictures of his body. Then the second thing that I did is I had them cover me. I was still holding on to Gabby and I couldn't let go, but I had them cover up Gabby. So the only thing that people could see were her high heels. She's a really small woman, and I'm a really big person. So while I was holding her, the only thing that people that were walking by could see was her heels. And when people started calling into the media to report what had happened, they were reporting that Gabby had been shot and that she was covered up like the other persons who had been killed. So for the first hour or so, there was confusion, and multiple news agencies actually reported that she had died and that she had been killed along with someone who looked like Santa Claus. And that was someone who we now know was Ron Barber. He's the new member of Congress. He was the district director. But he was someone who was alive. He wasn't severely injured in the way that a lot of other people were, but he was reported as having been killed. And this was one of the things that I learned, having lived through this, how much confusion there can be in an event like this. So when Boston happened a few weeks ago, when Newtown, Connecticut happened, when any kind of tragic event like this happens, there's always so much confusion. And sometimes it's days, weeks, and even months before we realize what's going on. So I'm going to open it up to questions. So any questions? There's a microphone that's... No questions. At all? I come all the way from Arizona, not one question. Well...
I hope this works. There we go.
There we go.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you. I think the story you told is riveting, and your ability to think quickly in that instant is really an amazing thing, and you certainly helped a lot of folks. I'm just wondering, like, sort of what lessons you take from that we can learn, in either how to prepare or how we can stop these sorts of things.
So that is a multi-pronged question, and I appreciate it. The question is lessons learned, and I think there's two different sets of distinct lessons that can be learned from something tragic like what happened on January 8th of 2011. The first is actually lessons that are in the book, so I won't go into too much detail about those. But one of the things that I thought was really a great takeaway that not just myself, but many of the other people that were survivors and first responders and victims is the importance of civility and kindness. It's something that we oftentimes talk about but doesn't get done because I think a lot of times we expect other people to be held to a higher standard and we expect them to be the ones that are civil, and we forget that if we don't show what we want to see from our politicians or from our elected officials, it's not going to happen. Civility is something that, again, is oftentimes talked about, and it's not just a switch that gets turned on and off. It's a process. It's something that's really difficult. And when we talk about kindness, I think the big takeaway about kindness is it's not a random act. It's something that's conscious. It's something that you need to work on. And it's something that's not about, laying down and kind of letting people walk all over you, but it's about being conscious and aware of what you're saying and what you're doing and how you do it and how that might impact others in your community. Things that we can do to prevent, and this is the second part of the question, how can we prevent something like this from happening again? And I think there's a lot of different things that can be done and a lot of different things that have been talked about since what happened in Tucson. The first is addressing mental health. Jared Loughner, who was the shooter, who was only about 8 months older than I am, was someone whose life has been completely wasted. He ended up killing 6 people and injuring 13 others. It's such a shame that even though there was red flags all the way through his middle and high school and years at a community college, no one ever was able to provide him the help. And what has happened in a lot of states, especially in my home state of Arizona, is up until a few days ago when they passed a new budget and expanded the Medicaid portion of our budget, people who were single childless adults received no health care. So a lot of the folks who needed it most, who had mental health issues, or were just people who were working but didn't have a spouse, didn't have any kids, didn't have any kind of support. And what has happened, unfortunately, is there's been this big stigma placed on mental illness, and I think that's one of the things that we need to look at very carefully. Mental illness is not just, schizophrenia. It is a spectrum. It goes everything from postpartum depression for a couple of months after someone has a child, all the way to what Jared Loughner has, which was paranoid dissociative schizophrenia, where he ended up thinking that the government was after him, that Gabby was trying to track him, and that the only way to fix this was by shooting her and other people. So that's the one thing, and I'll leave it at that because the questions on guns, I think, are going to be coming up. So I'll wait until those actually get asked before I start talking about those. But good question, and again, I think one of the biggest takeaways was not letting the actions of one mad person define a community. So that's why so many of us who were affected by what happened have dedicated ourselves to working and trying to improve the community. I'm a school board member. I was elected in November of 2011. I was the youngest elected official in Pima County, which is the county that I lived in. I was the youngest LGBT elected official in the country for about 9 months. But for me, it was important to work on education because it's such a pivotal part of our society, and I saw such a need for work to be done in my local community. So we've all found ways to give back, so that way we can say it wasn't the actions of one madman that's defining Tucson or Arizona or the United States as a community. It's the great work that we're doing every single day, whether it's people like Pat Maish, who is going around the country and speaking about gun violence, Congressman Ron Barber, who is now representing the same district that Gabby represented. It's finding your own way and your own passion to be able to give back. Oh, the microphone's over there, so I'll make sure that it comes over.
Is it on? Hi, I was in Phoenix when that happened, and I know what a huge story it was locally. What are you doing now, and are you involved with Mark and Gabby in their gun efforts?
So the question of what are you doing now is a really complicated one. I have my hand in a lot of different jars because I'm someone who doesn't like having free time. I'm constantly working and taking on new projects, but I only take on projects that I know I can do well and that I care about. So I was elected in November of 2011 to a school board. Was elected in a special election, and I'm serving through the beginning of 2015. So right now I'm debating whether or not I'm going to run again for re-election. I serve in a school district that's 95% low income, 94% minority. I have 19,000 students in my care, along with 4 other people. We have 1,500 employees and an $88 million budget. Well, we used to have an $88 million budget. Now we have an $82 million budget going into next year. I'm also working with a group called Mayors Against Illegal Guns, working on trying to reduce gun violence deaths, talking about common sense fixes that we can look at. I'm also on multiple nonprofit boards. I travel around the country and speak at universities, and I speak at different events. And then the last thing I do is, in my spare time, I'm working with a group called the Arizona Synod Board Coalition, and they're a group of 35 churches and other faith-based organizations that are looking at how can we provide a perspective of what the border is actually like to senators and representatives as they're working on comprehensive immigration reform and talking about the importance of social justice. So the question of what am I doing, I'm all over the place. But my main things are working on the school board, trying to work on education policy, working on common sense gun legislation, immigration reform, and also, occasionally going and speaking and sharing the book and the stories about what happened on January 8th. Thank you. And I don't routinely work with Americans for Responsible Solutions. They're working on elections, and I'm working mostly on, policies and lobbying and building a grassroots organization so that way people understand, the impacts of gun violence in our community. Most people don't realize that every day 34 Americans are dying because of gun violence. And this is just the homicides. Of those, 8 of them are children. And if you include the people that have done self-inflicted gun injuries and gun deaths, so suicide by gun, it actually goes from 34 to 88. So this is a silent crisis, and it's one of those things where if we were having an epidemic that was a flu that was killing 34 Americans each day, the CDC would be all over trying to find a cure. But because we've had this one-sided conversation for about 50 years in the political arena, we don't talk about gun violence the way that we should. I grew up in Tucson. I grew up around guns. I started shooting at the age of 9 with my dad, but he had a rule that if you shot it, you ate it. So I stopped shooting live things rather quickly because I didn't like the taste of pigeon. And that was one of the things that we hunted because it was a little bit harder, and he thought it would be an interesting experience. But growing up in Tucson and growing up around guns, it's been one of those things where I, for the first 2 years after the shooting, didn't talk about gun violence at all. I would talk about mental health. But being in Phoenix, actually, I'm a member of a statewide organization called the Arizona State School Board Association. And there was about 500 of us in a room in late December. And we're a rowdy bunch. When we have speakers, we talk over our speakers. So there's 600 of my closest school board member friends and myself when a woman burst into the meeting and said, 20 kids have been killed in Newtown, Connecticut. And even though I had chosen and had actually ignored a lot of requests to speak on this issue, I said, okay, something needs to be done. Something's different. Because being an elected official who's responsible for 19,000 kids and 1,500 employees, and seeing that even our most vulnerable population, our kids, are vulnerable to this kind of incident, I thought what I had experienced was an isolated incident. But what I did was I started reaching out to different organizations and trying to find out more information. I'm someone who likes data. I don't make decisions based on feelings. I make decisions based off of, whether or not it makes sense by looking at the numbers. And that's when I found out that everyday Americans are being killed to the tune of 34. And that's on average. There's days where we have shootings like what happened in Aurora, in Oak Creek in Wisconsin, Blackburn in Virginia. And I can keep listing cities where there have been mass shootings. But that was, I think, a really big wake-up call for me, and that's when I started working on things. So Gabby and Mark started Americans for Responsible Solutions on the anniversary of January the 8th, and I started working on things around the same time. there was questions here and here, I think.
Ideally, in an ideal United States, would handguns be available, not just registered, but available broadly?
You know, the question on guns, and I think coming from Arizona, I have a really different perspective than people in this part of the country. I come from a place where we have two back. We have the Wild West. The West was one with guns, so it's a part of our history. It's a part of our culture. Arizona actually has a state gun. It was a little strange when they designated it, because they designated it 2 months after Gabby was shot. But this goes to tell you the kind of place that I come from. So I don't think it's about taking people's guns away. I don't think it's about regulating, and having a registry. I think the important things is making sure that right now, people that are on the terrorist watch list who can't fly on a plane and can't take like a nail clipper onto a plane are able to walk into most gun stores in this country and still buy a gun because they're not a prohibited buyer. What we have in this country is a broken system where the background checks are not being done to the level that they should be, because states are not reporting all the information that they should on mental health. They're not reporting all their information on felonies. And a lot of times, they're not even requiring background checks, and that's the problem. So we need to streamline the process, make sure all the data is being reported, but also make sure that it's a requirement that everything is being done through a background check, because what's happening in a lot of places is up to 40% of the guns that are being traded are being sold on the second market in private transactions. So people aren't having to go through a background check. So there's people who are prohibited from buying it at a gun shop, walking into a gun show, and as long as their credit card clears, that's all they need to get it. But if they walk into a gun shop, they'd be prohibited because they're adjudicated as being mentally ill. They are people who shouldn't have them because they've been charged with felonies. There's also cases, and Arizona is one of the worst states. Women are getting killed with guns in Arizona by almost a larger margin than anywhere else. We're the 6th in terms of women being killed with guns in this country. What's happening a lot is women who are married or have a boyfriend or a partner or sometimes even a stalker report them. They get added to the list of prohibited buyers, because once you are filed a restraining order against you, you get placed on this list for some time. What they'll do is they'll go to a gun show, which happens all the time in Arizona, or they'll go and buy it on the internet, and then they'll do retribution on these women who are trying to keep themselves safe. But because we don't have the ability to stop those sales because they're being done legally, because there's not a requirement for there to be a background check, we're seeing a lot of deaths that way. So I hope that kind of answers your question. And
Check.
we have about 4 minutes, so I'm going to try and I'm a little verbose sometimes, so I'm going to try and keep it short.
I wanted to get your take on the media and the media printing and misinformation.
The question is on media and kind of what my take is. So after 1,637 interviews in 2 years, and I've kept track of all of them, I can tell you working with the media is a really interesting thing. I think one of the things that we've seen, unfortunately, is this desire to be first and to have your information be an exclusive. So I think we've seen in a lot of cases, whether it's Tucson or Aurora or Boston, a news agency will hear something that they think is a somewhat reliable tip and run with it because they want to be on record as having been the first to report it. And that's, I think, a big problem. We live in a culture that is instant gratification. We want our answers now. We want our information now. I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it, I think, to a large extent. Being on Twitter all the time, I get my news mostly from there, which is instant. But that instant and that urgency of now means that we're not getting well thought out, well researched, or well informed pieces of information. And that's what I think is really hurting the media right now, because they've lost a lot of credibility in a lot of places, not because they're bad people, but because the field that they work in is so competitive that they're just trying to have that small edge. And I think we have time for one last question, and I think it'll go to you.
So on January 8th, you acted very bravely, and it was amazing, the story. What I was wondering is, was there a time later when, like maybe when you were alone, like the horror of the events, did it hit you, and how did you deal with that emotionally, the trauma of what happened, you personally?
So how like when it sinks in, I think is the kind of question that you're referring to. And I'm going to do a little bit of a cop out and say I talk about it a lot in the book, which sounds awful, but I talk about for the first couple of hours after the shooting, there was so many people that needed to be interviewed by the FBI and by the sheriff's department that they actually held me in a small room while the FBI was interviewing everybody else on the scene because I was at the hospital and they could contain me and keep me in one place. So when they took Gabby in, a nurse came out and said that she had died. They then confiscated my cell phone and didn't allow me to talk to anyone for hours. I think it was about 7 or 8 that I wasn't in contact with anyone. So for 7 or 8 hours, I was under the impression that Gabby had been killed and also that Ron Barber had been killed, who was the district director. But that was, I think, one of the things where I had my initial breakdown where it was no matter what I had done, despite all the things that had happened, it had all been for naught because Gabby had passed away. And even Ron, who was in much better condition, and then I started having this moment of blaming myself where I said if I had just focused on Ron instead of helping Gabby, then maybe at least one of them would still be here. Now we know that they both survived. Gabby, is still recovering and is still struggling. But Ron, who was reported as being one that had died, hadn't. And Gabe, who had been reported as being alive, was killed on the scene. So that kind of goes back to the question on media, where we had so much confusion. And I had and I'll wrap this up because I know we're done. I had this really strange experience where the next day, not even the next day, 8 hours after the shooting, I was starting to do interviews about what had happened. So my process of kind of going through and processing emotionally what had happened wasn't done in private. It was done in front of cameras and in front of reporters. And I'm not going to recommend that for people. It is a really stressful and really difficult way to process things, especially as traumatic as what happened. But that's what ended up working with me. And I went to a counselor because I was ordered to 4 times. And after the 4th session, she said, you've done everything I would have recommended for you to do. You're coping with this as well as can be expected considering what happened. But just keep doing what you're doing, essentially. So I want to say thank you all so much for coming. It was a little tricky at times with the drum circle walking by, but I appreciate your patience, and hopefully we'll be able to see you in a little bit. We're going to be headed over to number 9. Number 9, if you would like to ask another question, or we're also going to be signing books. So I hope some of you will join us over at number 9. But again, thank you all so much. I'm very excited to... And before I leave, moment of privilege. Let's give a hands up to a clap for the first responders who are here helping us out. We're going to have a lot of scrapes and bruises this weekend. Let's hope nothing more severe than that. My dad came with me to a book signing a few weeks ago, and he had a seizure. So let's hope nothing like that happens this time. So thank you all so much.